Thank you for joining us today. We're pleased to be on our own backyard here in the state of Georgia. Welcome to this webinar that is sponsored by the Georgia Independent School Association. My name is Bill Baker. I'm with Firestorm right here in scenic Roswell. We got a nice, beautiful, sunshiny day in this part of the state, and we hope that we're past this rainy weather we've had. Today we're going to be discussing when your first school crisis is your crisis manager's first crisis. This is part of the Crisis Coach webinar series. It's the 8th in the 2015 series. We'd like to invite you to become our friend. Please be our friend at Firestorm Solutions on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Firestorm Soul. Yes, there is a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risks and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communication, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Please keep in mind, our discussion today is not complete without oral comments. The work product we provide must be considered in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel, and this information should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. Firestorm is delighted to have a ongoing relationship with the Georgia Independent School Association. They're the host, underwriter, and sponsor of this series of webinars. Our presenter today is going to be Jim Satterfield. He's the President and Chief Operating Officer of Firestorm. Jeff, I understand his conflicting things going on today. So
he's helping schools, which is where he needs to be.
That's right. Over to you, Jim.
Thanks. This is Jim Satterfield. Certainly glad to speak with everyone today and share this topic. Unfortunately, we're seeing schools in crises on a continual basis, and we had the horrific reminder last week of the events in Oregon and what occurred there, and I think it made us all stop and think more about our individual schools and what we need to have in place, and that's led us to today's topic to talk about it. By the way, you probably all noticed that there were two other schools that they uncovered threats before those threats were able to materialize. And anytime there's an event of the nature of what we saw in Oregon, we have found, unfortunately, that copycats will continue to occur. So when we think about a crisis, is it a danger or is it an opportunity? JFK in his book used a Chinese symbol for crisis, and he had indicated it was a combination of the symbol for danger and the symbol for opportunity. If we focus only on half of that, we're going to miss the directions and things that we need to be involved with. Our goal is always to how do we transform this crisis into value? How can we make a difference there? Because the trends of all future events will depend on how we manage through that crisis. And today, we're focused on the fact that you may have a crisis manager this is the first crisis they see will be the one that they experience, so they won't have dealt with this and it passed. And what can you do to help that crisis manager to do a better job? We're going to go behind the scenes a little bit and give you some of the things that you need to be aware of and understand, and the types of questions that you need to ask, the types of actions, the types of messages that you need to put out. All of that putting extra pressure on that crisis manager. As we think about the schools in Georgia, over the last several years, we've had to respond to a variety of different threats and issues, whether it was sexual molestation or violence or bullying or other events that's triggered that. The impact was significant on the schools that were involved. So as we think about a crisis, I want to remind you of some things that you already know, and then we'll go through things that you need to be doing. First, that most everything you learn in the first 24 hours is generally wrong. So what that means for your first-time crisis manager is that they're going to be forced to make decisions based upon wrong or incomplete information. We're going to hit that theme several times today, but it's easy to make a decision if you've got all the information. In a crisis, you're going to find out the information you have is wrong. Secondly, recognizing that that manager is going to be faced with the consequences of the decisions that have been made. And while initially what we learn is wrong, those consequences are going to be around for years to follow. You want your school to be known as, oh, that's the school where this occurred. And that it will determine a great deal of how you respond, the decisions that you make, and the messages that you in fact send out. So as we think about that, let's start to try to understand the attributes of a crisis or disaster. You've seen similar lists before that we've shared, but this is the attributes that your new crisis manager is going to be forced to deal with. The escalating events, the loss of command and control, that emphasis that every crisis is a human crisis. When the events happened in Oregon, all those parents wanted to know that their child was safe, and that became the driving issue for them. And obviously, if we don't speak or communicate it sometimes, that silence could be associated with guilt. And by definition, if it's a crisis that's emerging this way, it's going to be a surprise. I often share that the last time a surprise was good, I was 5, and it's my birthday. And when we think about a crisis, that's going to be the type of a situation that we find ourselves in. Now, I want to introduce you to a new thought today, and to put this in perspective, and particularly when we're thinking about our first-time crisis manager. It's the visibility vulnerability. As you're thinking about the vulnerabilities and risks that you face, or the hazard impact matrix as you're looking at your school and area, obviously if you're at the center of a crisis, you're going to have an elevated visibility, a visibility to the parents, to the students, to the media, and they're going to be focused on what you're doing and what you're saying at each of these individual points. And that is a vulnerability in and of itself. We've seen that in the political campaigns when someone is running for an office and they have, quote, the lead, or they're in the top, they're more visible, and so their words get closer analysis. So this visibility vulnerability will be absolutely critical when we think about a crisis environment, and you should be prepared and expecting it. There's one other aspect of the visibility vulnerability, and that is the ability to be able to see what's going to happen next. If you don't have an intelligence network, you're placing your new crisis manager at a significant disadvantage. Are you monitoring social media? How are you using it? What are the tools that you're using to do that? Because if someone has ill intent, 80% of the time someone else knows, and 67% of the time 2 or more people know, and when people know, they talk, and where do they talk? On social media. But even if it's not about identifying that threat, you can also be identifying what's the reaction to what people have seen us do or say. How will tell us a great deal about how we carry forward in each of these areas. So there is a visibility vulnerability in the fact that you're going to be exposed, and that you must have a knowledge of what's going on around you. By the way, the new term is merged media, the traditional and social media together. So now our crisis manager is sitting there, and they've got this visibility vulnerability. So let's talk a little bit more about the crisis environment that they find themselves in. Something's obviously happened. The crisis has occurred, or they wouldn't be here dealing with it. The senior leadership in your school or on your board has limited and even sometimes potentially wrong information. Maybe they've heard one side of the story from someone and not the other side of the story. There's confusion on the facts. What people want to know, what are we going to do now? What are we going to monitor? What are we going to say? The doing and saying will always be the critical elements for the crisis manager who finds themselves in a crisis. By the way, this might be something good to sit down and talk with your board about how the decisions will be made and communicated in a crisis so they're aware of it before the events ever occur. That's going to help a great deal. Clearly, you're going to be under scrutiny from your students, from your parents, the others there. The brand and reputation of your school will be the thing that will be paramount. Now, years ago, we talked about a golden hour in a crisis. That's really before today's world of instant news and social media with those elements happening. you had the chance to sit down and talk with your PR firm, with your board or your senior leadership or your crisis manager or your attorney. What are we going to do? What are we going to say? But now everything is instant. Before you're even able to react or make a statement, people are posting messages out there saying they didn't tell us this, they didn't inform us on what we needed to look for. And so this pressure now is a matter of golden seconds. And so in today, everybody wants to know everything before now. Before it even happens, they're expecting you to be on top of it and putting that in place. So that's a new change that your first-time crisis manager is going to find themselves in an area where the clock is ticking and moving very, very quickly, and they're expecting to know what it is they're to do and what it is they're to say. Now, if you're in any type of a job, you, in most cases, know what you know. In some cases, you know what you don't know. But there's a big exposed factor of what you don't know, you don't know. That big orange or red portion of this circle is one of the things to keep in mind, particularly with this first-time crisis manager. They've never managed a crisis before. They're not going to understand fully the significance of the events or the pace that they move. If we go back to a sports analogy, you hear sometimes with a veteran quarterback who will say, you know, the game is now starting to slow down for me. I can see what's happening. I can build my strategies. I can respond appropriately. So one of the things that if you want to help this first-time crisis manager is bring the insights about what it is that they don't know they don't know. You want to be able to learn that in going through a couple of discussions, talking about a test exercise, talking about what would you do if this occurred, what else would you want to know, how do we come together in each of these areas. So we're now laying a framework to start to wrap this new crisis manager with the level of support they're going to need to succeed. So where do you start all this? We've given you the background, we've talked about the environment, we've given you some good descriptors, but look at the two phrases here. A crisis is not business as usual, it's business as unusual. If it's been escalated to you or to your crisis manager that something's going on, it's not a normal day at school. Something has changed. And understanding that is where we're going to focus on and giving you the foundation to start to carry forward in each of these areas. So your crisis manager is going to be forced to make decisions. And how do you know if you've got the right person in that slot? And in most cases, we recommend that the crisis manager not be the head of school. They're going to be involved in dealing with a great many other issues. The team should be able to function and report back to the head of school and coordinate that. And particularly, we recommend that the head of school is not the initial spokesperson. If all the information we learn is wrong, we do not want to do anything to undermine the strength of that leadership. So what do you look for? You're looking for somebody that's going to be decisive, somebody that has excellent communication skills, somebody that can get that message out in the way that people will be able to respond. They have to have authority or expertise to be accepted. If they don't seem to have that authority, if they don't have the right kind of background, your team is not going to respond. Your parents won't respond well. Your students and teachers won't respond well. And they've got to have the ability to develop strong relationships throughout this process. So this person must be a leader, and we use the term general. Every crisis needs a general. If you think about a general, they're going to evaluate the situation, develop a course of action, give the orders, and expect them to be implemented. And a crisis is a great descriptor of that. So they have to be at ease in making these decisions. They have to be knowledgeable and a subject matter expert in a variety of areas. Also resourceful, because what you think will work may not, or you may not have all the assets that you need at that particular point in time, and so it's going to become extremely critical. The roles and responsibilities here are making decisions, and everything you see listed here will be issues that this group, this manager will have to deal with. The manager will need to be able to provide guidance, talk about the legal or the compliance requirements here, talking about being able to talk to your board or your or back to you if you're the head of school, and being able to manage this issue, to really integrate all of the tasks that are here. now you're starting to see that being this crisis manager is a complex entity. And one of the underlying strengths that you will need to have is a crisis management plan so that everybody understands what they need to do at each stage of this process. So if we're focused on that, how does this crisis manager fit into the events that were starting to occur? Now, you've seen us describe the 5 stages of escalation in a disaster or crisis. Pre-action is what you're doing today. That's attending a training class, learning more about it, getting your plans in place, getting your supplies there, conducting an exercise, testing your plans. When the event occurs, we're going to be focused on life and safety, and that's where the standard protocol in schools becomes so very important. Lockdown, lockout, shelter in place, and evacuate. And we're going to be focused on those life and safety issues. The emergency response plan would kick in. We do a high-level impact assessment and later a more in-detail look. And if it's a significant enough issue, then we declare a crisis, activate our crisis management plan, move on with our departmental continuity of operations plans, and get back up and running and recover as quickly as possible. Also, once it's over, we do our post-actions where we do the hot wash and understand what worked, what didn't work, what did we want to know that didn't. So this is the environment that new crisis manager is going to be forced to take action within and be able to respond. But let's go a little deeper into the crisis and divide that into a couple of different ways to help explain it. We have to look at the complexity of the crisis that we're focused in. And any crisis is bad, but the first is a targeted crisis. It's easily identifiable. It's complex. It can only become complex if we don't do a good job in managing the crisis. And it's a more straightforward mitigation. That's where the lightning strikes might come in, or the tornado, or the armed intruder, the active shooter. It's easily identifiable. We know what we're faced with. So is this a targeted crisis, or is it more complex, where it's got many attributes? Could be completing factors here. We could have had a data or a cyber breach. Maybe the information that you've gotten on your parents or your students has gotten out into the market or been stolen, or penetration. There could be an undercurrent between this group in the school is pushing this agenda and that group is pushing something else. It becomes much more complex as we're dealing with each of those elements. And it requires a much more sophisticated response. Now, if your first crisis is more targeted, that first-time crisis manager is probably going to do a better job. If it's this complex later one, where there are multiple attributes, multiple variables coming in, that's going to even be a greater challenge, and that's why you need to provide that crisis manager with more support. So if one attribute is the level of complexity, the other is the time to react. Now, always in a crisis, just given the nature, it's going to be active, reactive, and urgent. You're focused on the event, but the whole school is not shut down. Maybe we have a problem in a particular area. We're dealing with it there, but it doesn't go into all of the other aspects of it. And so, again, that first-time crisis manager will probably perform an acceptable level there. But if it's one that is of extreme urgency, the whole organization is consumed by the event. The college, the community college in Oregon is a great example that they were consumed by that, the urgency. You had to act now. We had an armed intruder. We had injuries and death. The whole organization is not going to function at this point in time. And so the decisions are becoming much more critical and disproportional. So with those attributes, the time to react and the level of complexity are going to be what's facing our new crisis manager. What is it that we want to tell them and have them think about? Well, they've got to identify the strategy of why they're taking the actions or making the communications. This concept of why needs to become an important one. If someone says we're going to do this, you need to be able to say why and understand the value of doing those. Now, we break everything down back into that predict, plan, perform. We want to be able to predict what's going to happen next. What is the impact of this? And you discuss that, and once you understand it, then you can better plan what your strategies or actions would be. And it's a high-level view. We're trying to get to this point. Once we've had this problem, we're going to send everyone home. We have to activate our reunification plan. That becomes the key driver for us at that point, or whatever element that you're associated with. And then perform is to identify what you're going to do and what you're going to say now. Now, if you find yourself in a crisis, or this new crisis manager does find themselves there, here's the quick test. What is it that you know? Then ask, are you concerned, and if so, about what? And you notice now we're starting to deal with the consequences of whatever occurred here. What's your strategy or your plan? What are you going to monitor? And the monitoring is critical. We're going to say that a bunch today. And the reason is, if everything you learned initially is wrong, you're going to be forced to then make decisions based upon wrong or incomplete information. So it becomes extremely critical. And then what are you going to communicate to whom, how, and why? Focused on that, and we recommend that communication, whenever possible, be direct and not through the media. And the media is not your friend at this point, and we'll share more about that in just a few minutes. Okay, so if this is our strategy and our quick test and our other things, what kind of questions would we be expecting to ask? Well, here's the questions that I see this new crisis manager needing to establish the answers. Specifically, what's occurred? What's known? Now, notice here it's known versus what do you think? What will happen next? What are you concerned about? What's your plan? What's your monitoring plan? What are the metrics? How are we going to know if we're doing a good job here? What are our 3 key messages? In a crisis, you're not going to be able to deliver 100 messages. You're not going to be able to send out a 4-page email. You need to be able to say 1, 2, 3. Here they are. This is what happened. This is what I need you to do, and this is when the next report will come out. What are your 3 key messages that you're going to share? Who is your spokesperson? And again, we recommend that the initial spokesperson not be the head of school, because the first information that you learn is wrong. What are the threats, risks, and vulnerabilities that we see coming as a result of this? Who are the internal and external parties? Who is involved within our school? Is this a teacher? Is this a student? Or is it parents? Is it someone on our staff? Are there groups that are using this as an excuse to change how we do something, or to put someone in a different position or life? Who are the external parties? Who's involved outside of the school? What's their agenda? And understanding everyone's agenda will determine a great deal about the actions that our first-time crisis manager is going to take. If you bring in outside resources, like a firm like Firestorm, by the way, here's a quick commercial. If you find yourself in a crisis, pick up the phone and give us a call, because it won't be our first movie. We will have been able to help you through it. But ask that outside crisis management firm come in through the general counsel for the school or the outside law firm that works there to establish an attorney-client privilege. Much of what we learn about in a crisis could ultimately be a source of litigation or other impact on the school, and so we want to be very, very careful in this process about that flow of information, and establish what your record retention policy is, both during and after the crisis, because in all likelihood there will be litigation around what's occurred. So if those are the questions, what are the actions? This is a partial list, but it gives you an idea of why that first-time crisis manager is going to be under such stress. Again, they have to establish what happened. They have to identify the key information kind of, who can get me more information on that? Who knows about this student? Who can tell me about what's occurred here? Identify the risks and vulnerabilities that are as a result of this and likely to yet still occur. They have to establish command and control. If we're in a crisis, we need to do that. If it's a violence episode, when the police arrive, they're going to establish command and control of your school, not you, but how you interface and react to them. There's that monitoring again, and the statistics are that if someone has ill intent, 80% of the time somebody else knows, and 67% 2 or more people know, and today when people know, they talk on social media. This is your opportunity to get that heads up that something is starting to happen. And so you want to monitor not only social media, but traditional media, and that's going to drive a great deal of influence. Who are our brand supporters? Who's for us? Who's against us? Who are our brand detractors? Who are the key stakeholders that we're concerned about? What's our initial messages? The key messages should be around the that you will not be defined by this event, that you'll invent the future, that you'll embrace the families. Keeping to those areas and letting the first responders or police, fire respond to what actually occurred is going to be significantly better. They're talking about the problem, you're talking about the solution in the future. Identify your spokesperson. Make sure they've got training. And even the training can be done virtually in at the time of a crisis. Clearly, it'd be better if that was established in advance. If it's a big enough event, you may need to open up a call center to handle all of the calls that start to come into your school. We may have to establish a way that we're going to post new information on our website or on our Facebook account and have that established. Many times in these crises, the websites become so overloaded that they shut down. Update the message maps. You should already have a crisis communications plan with message maps. If this occurs, how do we answer that? What's our first message? What's our second? What's our third? You always want to have those identified in advance to be prepared. And then look at whatever's happened. If you've had a situation that occurred where someone's arrested, well, at the arraignment or the bail hearing or the trial, those are going to trigger future media events and create an area that you're going to need to be able to address. Are we doing a press conference or we're doing a release? And the majority of the time, we're going to be recommending that you not. Firestorm has a strong why media strategy. Why are you going to the media at this point? We think that there are better ways to handle that communication directly to your parents, to your students, to your teachers. What's your move forward and having coordination calls with you're aware of what's happening and what the strategies are and what's to happen next. And if it's at another location, are you sending one there? Was this a field trip? Was it a sporting event? Did it happen here at the school? Did it happen somewhere else? Who is going to be tasked with that responsibility? So we've talked a lot about actions and questions. Let's start to shift the conversation over to communications. That's always a big issue. Now, as a general rule in a crisis, if you're explaining, you're losing. Well, the reason why we didn't know that is this, or, well, yeah, that happened, but it really wasn't. All of those conversations, you've lost now. So stop. Ask why you're going to communicate, and that's got to become your focus. What is it that you hope to gain? If something horrific has happened, let the police, let the fire department talk about that. You want to talk about the future and the solutions that are there. You do not want to be explaining the details on it. By the way, I'll share with you that in most of these cases, you couldn't talk about them because it's confidential information about a student or a teacher. And from any perspective, you're unable to share that. You can't tell one parent about someone else's child. And so it's not a matter that you can't talk or no comment or we can't talk about from a legal perspective because of a lawsuit. We can't talk because we can't share information about a student with a third party. It's illegal. It's not who we are. It's not what our school is about. So if you think about a crisis in communications, there are three buckets that they come in. You're doing a communications around coordination, around the crisis, or around compliance. The coordination is you're dealing it internally within the school and directing your teachers and staff and what you need them to do. And so those communications generally come very early on. It could be as simple as we're going on lockdown. So that you will clearly be understand. And the crisis communications that you're putting out are about the impacts on the brand and reputation of the school and better clarifying it. And generally those tend to be more external. Clearly you want the people internally to know, but it's really geared outward. And then lastly, there's some compliance requirements. You have some communications that you're going to need to know about. I listed cyber here just to give you an idea that hey, if the personal identifiable information or the personal health information gets out, you have an obligation. But similarly, if you become aware of an incident of violence against a child, where a child is threatened or in danger from sexual molestation or violence, you have an authority to report that to the Department of Family Services or the police. So there's some compliance communications that are here. So think about if you're coming in and asking for a communication, why are you communicating? Is it a coordination information communication? Is it a crisis communication? Or is it a compliance communication? As we continue to look at those communications, we remember the predict, plan, perform. So now that new crisis manager, you can slow it down so they can start to see it develop. And the first is, who is the audience? What are their concerns? What is it that parents need to know? Those will draft some of our communications around that and carrying it forward. The plan would be tailoring the message, the messenger, and media or medium. Maybe you have the instant notification system that you can send an email or a text message out or send a call. In some cases, picking up the phone and calling the parent of the child or children that are involved will be superior to sending anything in writing, since a lot of the information that we know would be wrong initially within it. So you want to tailor that message, the messenger, and the medium. By the way, it's easier to edit than it is to create. If you have message maps predetermined, it's a lot easier to update those than it is to try to create them at the time of the crisis. Then, as we think about it, focus on those three key messages. They will not be defined by this event. Whatever horrific thing happened, it's not about what your school is. It's not who your children are and your teachers. What are you going to do to make sure that this doesn't happen again? That's your invent the future. And lastly, it's about those that were impacted. You want to embrace the families and through that process. Again, let the first responders, let the fire and police deal with the details of whatever the event is. That's going to give you more advantage than anything else you can do in terms of communicating. So as we think about that, let's come back to this concept and kind of summarize and give you some specific directions now. It's about an if. If this happens, what are we going to do? Everybody wants warning. Everybody wants to know before now. If you can identify those behaviors of concern, or you can identify the issues that are happening in advance, it becomes extremely critical, because the crisis may be short, but the consequences will be there for a long time. And that's what you're going to be measured on. It's going to be the consequence management. That's what this first-time crisis manager is going to be evaluated on, is what were the consequences that came out of it? How do we stack up and carry forward? The strategic versus tactical. Early in the crisis, we're doing tactical things. That's the standard protocol, the lockdown, the lockout, the shelter in place, the evacuate. But it quickly shifts over to strategic. How is this going to affect us? What else do we need to be doing? And today we're in an environment that it's a business crisis risk, because if we're known as the school where this happened, it's going to have a long-term impact on our school, and that will start to define us as an organization, and that's not where we want to be. You must have an intelligence network. There's information occurring today about your school, about what people feel and think about it, and clearly in a crisis, if you don't have it in advance, you need it at that point just to see, is my message getting through? Or is this what are the people understanding what we need them to do, or what actually occurred? You must have an intelligence network or you're operating blind. Remember the general who's directing the battle now, and our crisis manager is serving as our general. Well, he needs to know where the enemy is. He needs to know what they're doing, what they're saying, the actions that are taking place. You can't run a crisis without understanding the intelligence of what's going on around you. So having an intelligence network is a key aid for that first-time crisis manager. And then you need instant access tools. We're very fortunate today that most people have a smartphone in their pocket. And the latest standard is to have that plan on that smartphone, to be downloaded to the teacher's phones, or in some cases the parents or even the student's phone. Because you're always within 3 feet of a smart device or a phone. And being able to go in and see, here's the emergency plan. These are the steps that I need to immediately take and do becomes a key element there. Now, maybe the crisis management team needs more detailed plans than just the emergency, or some other players may need more elements, but it could clearly be there and available on that smartphone. And so it becomes an instant access tool. That's where the big "it" is that's listed there. If your plans aren't on those types of devices, fighting today's battles with yesterday's tools. So a plan isn't a big binder that just sits on a shelf. It's got to be in the hands of the people that need it when they need it at that point in time. Again, this is going to help that first-time crisis manager as they come through. The other thing we want to train our crisis manager on is thinking about what's urgent and important. If we think about this urgency and importance factor, if it's not urgent, if it's not important, that big white square, we don't need them to be thinking about it now. We'll deal with that later. If it's important, but it's not urgent, again, in the crisis, we don't need to be focused there. If there's something that's happening and it may be urgent because we had something going on, but if it's not of high importance, we're not going to be focused there. Where we want to focus in the crisis with our crisis manager are only on those things that are urgent and important at the same time. Those are the things that we have to do now. And that focus will help your first-time crisis manager understand what they need to do. My recommendation is go through some test exercises. Talk about how we make these decisions and let them talk about what was urgent here. How do I know that? How do I know it was important? Now, crisis management can become very complex. Here are the same 5 stages that we showed with that little chart circling up to the right, but now they're laid out showing you what that crisis manager is going to be responsible for in each one of these 5 stages. And they're going to be looking at those questions down below, and people need to be focused on being prepared to answer those and supply that information. Managing a crisis is a complex event, and it all adds up to that consequence management. And as we return to the new normal, the PR, the critical decision support that takes place, what should we do now? What should we say? That's the environment you're placing this first-time crisis manager in, and why it's so very critical. So if you haven't created an intelligence network, I would strongly encourage you to do it before now, to have that already understood so that you're monitoring to see if the types of things that you're concerned about are starting to come up. As I shared earlier, the statistics show that people know, and when they know, they talk, and they talk today on social media. If your school is not monitoring it, if you don't have this type of an intelligence network, you're going to find yourself at a big disadvantage. And the because of this is that as we think through it, you've got to see how we're doing from a maturity model. Now, this is a maturity model tool that we created based upon the experiences that we've had. And we focus on a crisis on the decision process, the roles and responsibilities, the information clarity, the speed of decision making, and the communications effectiveness. Those are the 5 dimensions that become so very critical for this first-time crisis manager. And as we move, the goal is obviously to move your school and organization from the left-hand side of the page over to the right. You want to be out of this surprise and liability environment and into where it's strategic and part of your culture. And that's where your plans and your testing become so absolutely critical. So when you've had an event, either whether it's an exercise or an actual crisis, these are the parameters that you would use to evaluate what kind of a job are we doing? How is that coming together? Because remember that in that crisis, when minutes matter, seconds count. And so this crisis manager is going to be forced to be in that environment to make those decisions very, very quickly in each one of those stages, because that's what the crisis environment is. It's not that business as usual. It's the business as unusual. We've hopefully given you today some things to look for in that crisis manager, some of the questions that they need to ask, the actions that they need to take, and some insights into the communications that are starting to come forward that will fill in each of those areas. The way to slow it down for anyone is to follow the predict, plan, perform. When you find yourself in a crisis, predict what are the vulnerabilities and threats, what's going to happen next, what are their impacts, how do we monitor, see if that's occurring, and what's the trigger at which we're going to take the next action. Helping to understand that is going to slow the game down for your crisis manager to make them much more effective, to develop the plan that they need to have, the strategy, the procedures, the policies, and to the extent that you can put those in place in advance and then finally performing to test them, to have the supplies, and then to be able to monitor, because since most of what you find out initially is wrong, it's going to need to be adjusted at each one of those steps along the way. So if you're working with that first-time crisis manager, hopefully today we've given you some things to evaluate and talk, because the measurement here is going to be what are the consequences of the event that they're having to deal with. So what can you do now? Well, you need to know what's going to happen tomorrow. You can't afford today not to. That's where designing that intelligence network, to have your plans in place, to have your plans tested, so that everybody knows what's going to happen next and what's going to be coming through the process, whether it's a notification that's going out to the parents or how we're going to deal with reunification if something happens here, because it's not going to be the end of a normal school day. It's going to be a very different day. So planning those out, testing it, and making sure you have assigned responsibilities. Now, I recommend that you participate in an exercise with your team. You can design one up and do it in your school. We're going to run a virtual exercise on December the 8th and repeat it again on December the 14th. Now, this is going to be a little different than the one that we did this summer. We did a school crisis management event in August with a lightning strike and a tornado, and looking at where the gaps were in the school and having your team focus on it. This exercise is going to be a cyber breach, and if that's not something that you're concerned about at this time, that may not be as good a fit as another one. If you've got a particular one you would like us to design as a school exercise at a future date, let us know and we'll plan and schedule it. But on December the 8th at 2 o'clock Eastern and on December the 14th at 2 o'clock Eastern, we're going to be doing a virtual cyber breach exercise. And we expect a lot of corporations involved in that. But remember also, your school has a great deal of information about the tuition and your parents and students' personal identifiable information, public personal health information. So there's a great many cyber exposure opportunities there, and we have seen breaches occur in schools. You want to make sure your plans align to standards and best practices. Do you have a reunification plan? Do you have a crisis management plan? Do you have a crisis communications plan? Do you follow the standard protocol? More importantly, do you have a behavioral risk threat assessment program to identify those behaviors of concern before they escalate and become violence? Then you want to make sure that you have those and that your plans align to those standards. You want to design your own intelligence network and be aware so that it's not coming as a surprise. You need to have an instant access tool so that your people have access to that plan when they need it, how they need it, and then do that training. If you would like a brief on today's webinar, you'll be able to go in a couple of days to the Firestorm website and download a brief regarding this webinar and what you need to do when it's your first crisis for your crisis manager, and you can download that. By the way, there are briefs there on all of the webinars we have done, and those are great training tools as you would help to see your plan put in place. If you've got questions and you would like to have some follow-up resulting on this, you can contact us at Firestorm. Our thanks today to the Georgia Association of Independent Schools for underwriting and supporting this Crisis Coach webinar series and the information that's been shared. If you'd like to reach out to Firestorm, you can contact us by going to our website. You can fill out a contact form there at firestorm.com or send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com or call us at 800-321-2219. We're going to try to reach out to those schools in attendance today to see if you've got questions and give you some, and see if there are areas that we can help. And again, if you need us, please give us a call. Because of your membership in the Georgia Independent School Association, if you find yourself in a crisis, that first hour of support and consultation with Firestorm is a part of your membership. We'd rather talk to you and find out, it's not really that severe a crisis, than letting you have that crisis escalate rapidly in finding your school and students at risk. Thank you for investing 45 minutes of time with us today. We were glad to share our thoughts and insights, And it is a tough time when your school's crisis is your crisis manager's first crisis. Having a plan in advance, having it tested, understanding what your messages are, and importantly, when those messages will go out becomes absolutely critical. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day. I look forward to speaking with you again next month. Goodbye.